Sarah Chen pressed her face against the cool glass of the observation deck, watching the twin suns of New Eden paint the sky in brilliant orange and pink. At 8 years old, she had never seen Earth's single yellow sun, but her grandmother's stories made her dream of blue skies and white clouds. Here on humanity's newest colony, everything was different, but beautiful in its own way. "Sarah, come help with the younger ones," called Miss Martinez from across the daycare center. The New Eden Children's Center was the pride of the colony, a gleaming structure that housed and educated the 137 children who called this distant world home. Their parents worked the mines, built the cities, and dreamed of the future their children would inherit among the stars. The morning routine was always the same. Sarah helped dress the 3-year-olds, sharing stories about the strange purple flowers that grew in the colony's gardens and the way the larger sun made shadows dance differently than back on Earth. The children giggled at her impressions of the local bird-like creatures, their laughter echoing through the halls like music. Marcus Williams, aged 10 and already dreaming of becoming an engineer like his father, showed the younger kids how to build towers with blocks that defied gravity thanks to New Eden's lighter gravitational pull. His structures soared higher than anything possible on Earth, and the children clapped in wonder as each creation seemed to touch the sky through the center's massive windows. Little Emma Santos, barely 4 years old, carried her stuffed rabbit everywhere and spoke in a mixture of English and the Portuguese her mother whispered to her at bedtime. She had drawn pictures on the walls with permission, colorful stick figures of her family beneath New Eden's twin suns, surrounded by the strange crystalline trees that grew in the colony's parks. None of them knew that high above their heads, ships were moving through space with deadly intent. The Zephyrian raiding fleet had been tracking human expansion for months. Their species had dominated this sector of the galaxy for 3,000 years, taking what they wanted from younger civilizations through superior technology and ruthless efficiency. To them, humans were just another upstart species that needed to learn their place in the galactic hierarchy. Commander Vextal stood on the bridge of the Devourer, his scaled hide gleaming under the harsh lights of the command center. The Zephyrians resembled massive reptiles with 6 arms and cold, calculating eyes that had watched the rise and fall of dozens of civilizations. They had perfected the art of conquest through terror, and their raids were legendary for their psychological impact as much as their material gains. "The human colony shows no military defenses," reported his second-in-command, scanning the data streams from their reconnaissance probes. Population approximately 50,000, primarily miners and agricultural workers, standard colonial setup. Vexthal's mandibles clicked in satisfaction. Humans had been expanding rapidly through this sector, claiming worlds with valuable mineral deposits and establishing colonies with surprising efficiency, but they were still young, still naive about the realities of galactic politics. The Zephyrian Empire had decided it was time to teach them a lesson about respecting established territorial claims. Begin descent. Target the population centers first. We want survivors to spread word of our power. The commander's voice carried the casual tone of someone who had performed this routine hundreds of times before. Down on New Eden's surface, the first sign of trouble came when the communications array went silent. Colonial Administrator Janet Torres noticed it first during her morning briefings. The regular check-ins from the orbital monitoring stations simply stopped, replaced by static. "Probably solar interference from the binary star system," suggested her aide. It happened sometimes when both suns align. But Torres had been a colonial administrator for 20 years, and she had learned to trust her instincts. Something felt wrong. She reached for the Emergency Protocols Manual, a thick binder that had never been opened since the colony's founding 3 years ago. At the Children's Center, Miss Martinez was reading a story about brave explorers discovering new worlds when the lights flickered. The children looked up, momentarily distracted from their lessons. Sarah Chen noticed that the birds outside had gone silent, and the usual hum of the colony's machinery seemed somehow muted. "What's that noise?" asked Marcus, pointing toward the windows. A low rumble was building in the distance, like thunder, but wrong somehow. Too sustained, too deliberate. Through the observation deck windows they could see black shapes descending from the sky. Not the familiar shuttles that brought supplies from the orbital stations, but something else entirely. Something that made the hair on Sarah's arm stand up, even though she couldn't explain why. Miss Martinez moved quickly to the communication panel, but found only static. The colony's emergency protocols were clear. In case of unknown contact, gather the children in the secure areas and wait for adult guidance. But as the black shapes grew larger and the rumbling grew louder, she began to realize that guidance might not be coming. The first Zephyrian ship landed in the colony's central plaza with a thunder that shook every building in the settlement. 12 feet tall and armed with weapons that could slice through steel like paper, the raiders emerged with the casual confidence of apex predators. They had done this so many times before that it had become routine. Land, terrify, take what they wanted, leave enough survivors to spread fear to other colonies. But as they advanced through the streets of New Eden, something unexpected happened. The human colonists didn't scatter in panic as most species did when faced with Zephyrian raiders. Instead, they fought back with a desperate ferocity that surprised the invaders. James Chen, Sarah's father, grabbed a mining laser and held them off from the residential quarter for 12 minutes before being overwhelmed. Maria Santos threw herself between the raiders and a group of evacuating civilians, buying precious time with her life. Across the colony, ordinary humans who had never imagined themselves as warriors picked up tools and improvised weapons, turning every street into a battlefield. The resistance was fierce, but ultimately futile. The Zephyrians had technology that turned buildings to dust and weapons that could stop a human heart from 100 meters away. Within 2 hours, the colony's adult population was either dead or captured, and the raids moved into the final phase, psychological warfare. This was where the Zephyrians made their crucial mistake. This was where they crossed the line that would doom their entire civilization. At the Children's Center, Miss Martinez had barricaded the doors and gathered all 137 children in the central playroom. The building's emergency systems had sealed the windows with armored plates, but they could still hear the sounds of battle growing closer. The younger children cried softly while the older ones tried to be brave, comforting their friends even as their own hearts hammered with fear. Sarah Chen held Emma Santos's hand and whispered made-up stories about brave princesses and magical rabbits. Marcus Williams organized the other older kids to help keep the little ones calm. They were children, innocent and helpless, trapped in a nightmare they couldn't understand. When the Zephyrian raiders finally broke through the barricades, they found something they had encountered countless times before on dozens of worlds: the young of a conquered species, defenseless and terrified. In Zephyrian culture, the young of conquered enemies were considered the ultimate psychological weapon. Breaking them broke the spirit of the adults, and their suffering served as a warning that echoed across the stars. What happened next in the New Eden Children's Center would be recorded by the Zephyrians themselves, as they always documented their conquests for future psychological warfare. The recordings would later be discovered by human forces and transmitted across the galaxy, becoming the spark that ignited something the universe had never seen before. Commander Vex Thal entered the center personally, flanked by his most experienced warriors. They had perfected techniques of intimidation and torture that left psychological scars lasting generations. The screams of the young were particularly effective at breaking the will of any surviving adults. Miss Martinez stood in front of the children, her arms spread wide in a gesture that every human recognized but no Zephyrian could understand: the absolute, instinctive protection of the young. "Please," she said, her voice steady despite her terror. "They're just children. Take me instead. Take anything you want, but please don't hurt them." The Zephyrian commander's mandibles clicked in what passed for laughter among his species. He had heard similar pleas on dozens of worlds in hundreds of languages. The response was always the same: mercy was weakness, and weakness invited further resistance. Better to eliminate the possibility of future rebellion by ensuring that the cost of defying the Zephyrian Empire was burned into the collective memory of the species. What followed was systematic, calculated, and recorded in clinical detail by warriors who had performed similar acts across the galaxy. They worked with the efficiency of a machine, turning the bright, cheerful Children's Center into something that would haunt the nightmares of anyone who witnessed the aftermath. Sarah Chen's last conscious thought was a confused question about why the pretty lizard man was hurting her friends. Marcus Williams tried to protect the younger children until the very end, his engineer's mind frantically trying to solve a problem that had no solution. Little Emma Santos called for her mother in Portuguese as her stuffed rabbit fell from lifeless fingers. Miss Martinez fought like a wounded animal, clawing and screaming as she tried to reach her students. Her love for them gave her strength beyond anything the Zephyrians had calculated for, but it only prolonged her agony, as she was forced to watch their systematic destruction before joining them in death. When the butchery was finished, Commander Vex Thal surveyed the scene with satisfaction. The message was clear. This was what happened to species that resisted Zephyrian authority. The recordings would be transmitted to other human colonies, and fear would spread faster than any military fleet. But as his warriors prepared to leave New Eden behind, something happened that would change the course of galactic history. Hidden in the center's basement, a single survivor watched through the building's internal monitoring system as the raiders departed. Dr. Elizabeth Harper, the colony's xenobiologist, had been conducting research in the lower levels when the attack began. She'd watched everything, recorded everything. And now, as the Zephyrian ships lifted off into space, she activated a quantum communication beacon that would carry the truth of New Eden across the galaxy at faster-than-light speeds. The message was simple, transmitted on every human frequency. They killed our children. All of them. The children of New Eden are gone. In the depths of space, human ships picked up the transmission. On distant colonies, parents read the reports and felt something break inside their hearts. On Earth itself, in the halls of the Human Colonial Authority, officials watched the recovered security footage and witnessed the systematic murder of 137 innocents. But more than that, they watched the faces of the children in their final moments. Sarah Chen's confusion, Marcus Williams' desperate courage, little Emma Santos calling for her mother, Miss Martinez's futile, beautiful attempt to shield them with her own body. The Zephyrians had calculated the psychological impact of their actions on human morale. They had factored in fear, despair, and submission. What they had not calculated was the possibility that their atrocity would not break human spirit, but forge it into something new and terrible. Across the galaxy, human colonies began to mobilize not in retreat, but in preparation. Mining equipment was retrofitted into weapons. Cargo ships were modified for military purposes. Scientists began working around the clock on projects whose names were classified above the highest levels of government. Because the Zephyrians had made a fundamental error in their understanding of human psychology. They had believed that causing maximum pain to the most innocent would create maximum fear. Instead, they had created something that would hunt them across every star system, through every nebula, to the very edge of the known universe. They had created a species with nothing left to lose and everything to avenge. As Dr. Harper's transmission reached the outer colonies and Earth itself, a single phrase began appearing in human communications across the galaxy. Scrawled on walls, transmitted in coded messages, whispered in the corridors of military bases, "Remember New Eden." The children were dead. The innocents were gone. And, now, the entire galaxy was about to learn what happened when someone hurt humanity's young. The war that would end the Zephyrian Empire had begun not with a declaration or a treaty, but with the recorded screams of murdered children. And every human who heard those recordings felt something ancient and primal awaken in the depths of their soul. The absolute, uncompromising need to protect the innocent and punish those who would harm them. The Zephyrians had thought they were sending a message about power and fear. Instead, they had written their own death sentence in the blood of children, and humanity was about to deliver that sentence with a precision and determination that would become legend among the stars. Admiral Rebecca Morrison had seen combat across 3 star systems and witnessed the aftermath of Zephyrian raids on a dozen worlds, but nothing had prepared her for the footage from New Eden. She sat in her command center aboard the UHS Retribution, watching the security recordings for the 5th time, her hands clenched so tightly that her knuckles had gone white. The bridge crew around her worked in unusual silence. Word of New Eden had spread through the fleet faster than official communications, passed from ship to ship by crew members who couldn't contain their horror and rage. Every human in the fleet had watched the recordings. Every human in the fleet had seen the faces of the children. Admiral, her communications officer, spoke quietly. "We're receiving similar reports from other sectors. The Zephyrians have hit 3 more human colonies in the past week. Same pattern, same methodology." Morrison closed her eyes, but even in darkness she could still see Sarah Chen's confused face, Marcus Williams's brave attempt to protect the younger children, little Emma Santos reaching for her stuffed rabbit with dying fingers. When she opened them again, something fundamental had changed in her expression. "Signal all ships in the fleet. We're changing our mission parameters." "Ma'am, our orders are to patrol the neutral zone and our orders just changed." Morrison's voice carried a steel that made veteran officers straighten in their chairs. "We're going hunting." Across human space, the reaction was the same. On the agricultural world of Greenhaven, colonists watched the New Eden footage and began converting their farming equipment into weapons of war. On the mining station of Deep Core 7, workers with no military training volunteered en masse for combat duty. On Earth itself, recruitment centers were overwhelmed by citizens demanding to join the military response. But the most significant response came from places the public never saw. The research facilities buried deep beneath Earth's surface, where humanity's brightest minds worked on projects that officially didn't exist. Dr. Yuki Tanaka had been working on theoretical xenobiology when the New Eden recordings reached Earth. Like millions of others, she watched the footage and felt something break inside her chest. But unlike most people, she had the scientific knowledge to turn her grief into something concrete and terrible. "We know everything about their biology," she told her research team in an emergency meeting. 3 years of contact, dozens of encounters, tissue samples from their raids. We know their genetic structure, their reproductive cycles, their metabolic weaknesses, The laboratory fell silent as the implications became clear. Dr. Weyers saw. Tanaka's work on alien biology had been purely academic until now, focused on understanding the diverse life forms humanity encountered among the stars. But the same knowledge that could cure diseases could also create them. "Are you suggesting what I think you're suggesting?" asked Dr. James Wright, her longtime colleague and friend. Tanaka looked at him with eyes that had watched children die for no reason other than calculated cruelty. "I'm suggesting we make sure they can never hurt another human child. Ever." Meanwhile, in the Outer Rim colonies, a different kind of war preparation was beginning. Captain Elena Rodriguez commanded a small patrol ship called the Vengeance, tasked with protecting convoys in the disputed border regions. Her crew was small, her ship was old, but every human aboard had lost someone to Zephyrian raids over the past decade. "Captain," her tactical officer reported, "we're detecting a Zephyrian scouting party, 3 ships, approaching the Harmony system." Harmony was a peaceful farming colony with 12,000 inhabitants and a small population of children. Under normal circumstances, Rodriguez would have alerted the colonial authorities and requested backup from the nearest military base. But these were not normal circumstances. "All hands, this is the captain. We have Zephyrian raiders heading toward Harmony Colony. After what happened on New Eden, I'm not going to stand by and watch them hurt more children. Anyone who wants to transfer off my ship at the next port is welcome to do so with no questions asked. Anyone who stays, we're going to war." The crew's response was immediate and unanimous. They had all seen the footage, they had all heard the children's screams, and they had all made the same decision that Rodriguez had: never again. The Vengeance was not built for military confrontation with Zephyrian raiders. It was a converted cargo hauler with minimal weapons and shields designed for asteroid mining rather than ship-to-ship combat. But Rodriguez's crew had advantages the Zephyrians couldn't calculate: absolute determination and nothing left to lose. They intercepted the raiding party at the edge of the Harmony system, broadcasting a simple message: "Turn around and leave, or we will stop you." The Zephyrian response was predictably arrogant. These humans had a single ship against 3, inferior weapons, and no military training. The lead raider, Subcommander Kethral, opened fire without bothering to reply to their transmission. What happened next became the first recorded instance of what military historians would later call New Eden syndrome, the tactical innovation that emerged when humans decided that survival was less important than protecting innocence. Rodriguez didn't try to outfight the Zephyrian ships. Instead, she ordered her crew to ram the lead raider at maximum speed while simultaneously detonating their cargo hold, which contained mining explosives meant for the asteroid belts. The explosion took out both ships and heavily damaged the second raider. The third Zephyrian vessel found itself facing the wreckage of a human ship whose crew had literally sacrificed themselves to prevent another New Eden. But before the surviving raiders could process what they had witnessed, emergency signals began lighting up their sensors. Harmony Colony had received the warning about incoming raiders and had activated every defensive system they possessed. But more than that, they had transmitted the alert to every human ship in the sector. Within minutes, cargo haulers, mining vessels, and civilian transports were converging on the system, all crewed by humans who had watched the New Eden footage and made the same choice as Captain Rodriguez. The surviving Zephyrian ships fled, but not before recording something that would trouble their military analysts for months to come. Humans who fought not for conquest or resources, but for the abstract concept of protecting children they had never met on a world they had never visited. Back on Earth, the human colonial authority was grappling with a crisis unlike anything in their history. The official response to New Eden had been measured and diplomatic: demands for Zephyrian accountability, threats of economic sanctions, appeals to the galactic community for intervention. But the public response had moved far beyond official channels. Director Sarah Kim sat in an emergency session with the Colonial Council, trying to explain why human colonies across the galaxy were militarizing without authorization and why recruitment centers couldn't process the flood of volunteers fast enough. "The people have seen what the Zephyrians do to our children," she said simply. "You can't expect them to sit still and wait for diplomatic solutions. But this spontaneous militarization is exactly what the Zephyrians want," protested Councillor Martinez. "They're trying to provoke us into a war we can't win. Their technology is centuries ahead of ours. Their military is battle-tested across the galaxy. If we fight them directly, we'll lose." Director Kim pulled up the latest reports from the Outer Rim colonies. Cargo ships retrofitted with weapons, mining equipment converted to military purposes, civilian volunteers learning combat tactics in makeshift training camps. "Look at these numbers, Counselor. Look at the recruitment rates, the resource allocation, the innovation happening in our colonies. Does this look like a species preparing to lose?" The truth was becoming clear to anyone willing to see it. The New Eden massacre had not broken human spirit, but had instead awakened something that had been dormant since humanity's earliest days on Earth. The protective instinct that had driven their ancestors to fight predators with primitive weapons, to protect their tribes against overwhelming odds, to choose death over the submission that would leave their children vulnerable. On the research station Prometheus, Dr. Kachia, Tanaka's team had made their first breakthrough. Working around the clock, they had identified several potential biological weapons specifically tailored to Zephyrian physiology. But Tanaka found herself hesitating as she reviewed the data. This virus would target their reproductive system, she explained to Dr. Nero, right during a quiet moment between experiments. It would make them sterile within a generation. Their entire species would slowly go extinct. Wright looked at the data with the clinical eye of a scientist, but his voice carried the weight of a man who had watched children die. Is that worse than what they did to Sarah Chen, to Marcus Williams, to Emma Santos? Tanaka stared at the genetic sequences on her screen, thinking about the moral implications of genocide versus the simple fact that somewhere in the galaxy, right now, Zephyrian raiders might be approaching another children's center. No, she said finally. It's not worse. And if we don't do something, they'll keep killing our children until there are none left. The decision was made not by governments or military commands, but by scientists who had become fathers and mothers to every human child in the galaxy. Dr. Tanaka's team began weaponizing their research with the same methodical precision that had made them excellent xenobiologists. Meanwhile, Admiral Morrison's fleet had received unofficial support from across human space. Cargo ships arrived daily carrying weapons, ammunition, and volunteers from every corner of humanity's colonial expansion. The Retribution, designed to carry a crew of 800, now housed over 3,000 humans determined to make the Zephyrians pay for New Eden. "Admiral," her intelligence officer reported, "we've located the Zephyrian base where the New Eden raiders returned. It's a fortress system called Keth Mora, heavily defended, home to approximately 2 million Zephyrian civilians." Morrison studied the tactical display, calculating odds that would normally make her recommend against any direct assault. The Zephyrian base had shields that could deflect asteroid impacts, weapons that could destroy ships from 1,000,000 kilometers away, and defensive systems perfected over centuries of galactic warfare. "Recommendations?" she asked her staff. "Wait for reinforcements," suggested her tactical officer. "Build up our forces, develop new weapons, approach this strategically over months or years." Morrison thought about the children of New Eden, about the recordings that played in her dreams every night, about Sarah Chen's confusion as she died for no reason other than calculated terror. "No," she said, "we go now. Because while we're building up our forces, strategically they're killing more children. The attack on Keth Mora would become the first major battle of what history would record as the Human-Zephyrian War, but which participants would always call the Children's War." Morrison's fleet approached the fortress system with ships that should have been no match for Zephyrian technology and tactics that defied every principle of military strategy. They didn't try to outfight the Zephyrian defenses. Instead, they used the same innovation that Captain Rodriguez had pioneered. They accepted that survival was less important than stopping the enemy. Human ships loaded with explosives rammed Zephyrian battle platforms. Mining vessels converted to carry nuclear devices detonated themselves against shield generators. Cargo haulers full of volunteers flew directly into defensive installations, trading their lives for the chance to weaken the base's defenses. The Zephyrians had never encountered an enemy willing to accept unlimited casualties to achieve victory. Their military doctrine was based on calculated risk, strategic advantage, and the assumption that all species value their own survival above abstract principles. But the humans attacking Keth Mora fought as if survival was irrelevant compared to making the Zephyrians pay for what they had done to children. When the battle ended, Keth Mora was a ruin, and Admiral Morrison's fleet was gone. But the message had been sent across the galaxy. Humanity would pay any price to avenge their young. The recordings of human ships deliberately sacrificing themselves to breach Zephyrian defenses spread through alien networks, causing confusion and concern among species who had coexisted peacefully with the Zephyrian Empire for centuries. On Earth, Dr. Tanaka's team completed their biological weapons program. On the Outer Rim colonies, human settlements continued converting their entire economies to war production. In the deep space mining stations, workers volunteered for suicide missions against Zephyrian targets. But perhaps most significantly, in the halls of the Galactic Council, alien diplomats began to realize that something fundamental had changed in the galaxy's balance of power. The humans had been dismissed as a young species still learning the rules of interstellar politics. The New Eden massacre was supposed to teach them their place in the galactic hierarchy. Instead, it had awakened something that made other species uncomfortable, a civilization that valued the protection of innocence more than its own survival. The implications were staggering for a galaxy that had operated on principles of calculated self-interest for millennia. The Zephyrian Empire had wanted to send a message about power and fear, but the message the galaxy received was different. Humanity would destroy itself and anyone else necessary to protect their children, and that made them more dangerous than any military technology or strategic alliance. The Children's War had begun, and across the galaxy, civilizations began to realize that they were witnessing something unprecedented in galactic history. An entire species choosing revenge over survival, justice over safety, and the protection of innocence over the preservation of their own civilization. The Zephyrians had awakened humanity's fury. Now they would face the consequences of that choice, along with anyone who stood in the way of human justice. Because the children of New Eden would be avenged, no matter what the cost to humanity itself. The Galactic Council Chambers had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations for over 10,000 years, but never had the ancient halls felt the tension that filled them now. Representatives from 43 species sat in their designated sectors, all watching the human delegation with expressions ranging from curiosity to outright fear. Ambassador Chen Lu stood at the central podium, her face bearing the same calm determination that her species had displayed since the New Eden massacre 6 months ago. Behind her, holographic displays showed the current state of human Zephyrian conflict. 17 Zephyrian military installations destroyed, 4 Zephyrian colonies evacuated, and the complete militarization of human space. "Honored delegates," Chen began, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber's acoustics, "we come before you today not to ask for assistance, but to provide notification of our intentions regarding the Zephyrian Empire." The Altarian representative, a crystalline being whose species had mediated galactic conflicts for millennia, spoke first. "Ambassador Chen, the Council is concerned about the escalation of hostilities. The Zephyrians have agreed to discuss reparations for the New Eden. Surely diplomatic solutions. There will be no diplomatic solutions." Chen's interruption sent a ripple of shock through the chamber. In 10,000 years of Council history, species at war had always sought mediation, always looked for face-saving compromises. The Zephyrian Empire made a choice when they systematically murdered 137 human children. "We have made our choice in response." The holographic displays changed, showing footage that made several alien delegates look away. Tanaka's biological weapons program had achieved its first field test on a Zephyrian outpost. The virus spread through their population with engineered precision, targeting their reproductive systems while leaving them conscious enough to understand what was happening to them. "You are committing genocide," accused the vegan representative, their species' pacifist philosophy evident in every word. "The children you claim to avenge would not want this violence done in their name." Ambassador Chen's expression didn't change, but something cold and terrible flickered in her eyes. "The children we are avenging are dead. They don't want anything anymore. But the children who are still alive across the galaxy deserve to know that anyone who harms them will face absolute consequences." The implications were staggering. The humans weren't just waging war against the Zephyrians. They were establishing a precedent that would echo across galactic politics for generations. Any species that harmed human children would face not just military retaliation, but biological warfare designed to ensure their extinction. On the Zephyrian homeworld of Zeph Prime, Emperor Kralfane convened his war council in emergency session. The massive chamber had hosted military planning for 3,000 years of galactic conquest, but never had the discussions been focused on species survival rather than territorial expansion. "Report," the Emperor commanded, his 6 arms gesturing impatiently as holographic displays showed the systematic destruction of Zephyrian military assets across their empire. War leader Vox Tar, veteran of 100 campaigns, presented the analysis with visible confusion. "Your Magnificence, the humans are fighting in a manner that defies all military logic. They accept casualty rates that should have broken their will to fight within weeks. Their tactics prioritize inflicting damage over preserving their own forces. Then we crush them with overwhelming force," the Emperor replied. "Deploy the 7th Fleet. Destroy their homeworld. End this rebellion before it spreads. Your Magnificence." Vox Tar hesitated before continuing. "The 7th Fleet no longer exists. The humans, they infected the crew with a biological agent that prevented reproduction. The fleet surrendered rather than face the extinction of their bloodlines." The Emperor's mandibles clicked in what would have been laughter if the situation weren't so serious. Impossible. No species would prioritize abstract vengeance over genetic survival. But the reports from across the Zephyrian Empire told a different story. Human attack patterns showed no regard for strategic value or tactical advantage. They targeted Zephyrian breeding facilities, research centers focused on reproductive biology, and even civilian population centers where Zephyrian children were raised. The humans had studied their enemy with scientific precision and had crafted a response specifically designed to cause maximum psychological damage while ensuring long-term extinction. It was biological warfare elevated to an art form, and it was working. On the human research station Prometheus, Dr. Tanaka monitored the results of her work with the detached precision of a scientist and the burning satisfaction of a woman who had watched children die for no reason. Her biological weapons had evolved beyond the simple sterility virus, incorporating elements that targeted Zephyrian memory centers, pain receptors, and social bonding mechanisms. The latest strain ensures they remember every human child they've killed, she explained to her research team. It enhances their capacity for guilt and regret while simultaneously destroying their ability to form new emotional bonds. They become isolated within their own minds, haunted by the faces of their victims. Dr. Peary. Wright reviewed the psychological warfare profiles with growing unease. Yuki, this goes beyond military necessity. We're talking about torture on a species-wide scale. Tanaka pulled up the New Eden security footage on her screen, pointing to the moment when little Emma Santos called for her mother in Portuguese. Tell me, James, what level of suffering is appropriate for someone who killed this child? What amount of pain adequately responds to systematically murdering 137 innocents? Wright had no answer. None of them did. The moral calculations that had once seemed clear had been shattered by the recordings from New Eden, leaving only the stark choice between justice and mercy for those who had shown no mercy to children. Meanwhile, across human space, the war effort had transformed their entire civilization. On the agricultural world of Green Haven, former farmers now worked in weapons factories, growing crops specifically designed to feed human military forces. On the mining stations of the asteroid belt, workers extracted materials for warships that would never return home, crewed by volunteers who understood that their missions were one way. Captain Maria Santos, sister of the little girl who had died holding her stuffed rabbit on New Eden, commanded a converted cargo hauler called the Emma's Vengeance. Her crew of 37 volunteers had spent their life savings converting the ship into a biological weapons delivery system. Captain, her pilot reported, we're approaching the Zephyrian breeding world of Kethnara, population approximately 5 million, mostly civilian families. Santos studied the tactical display, thinking about her sister's last moments. Emma had been 4 years old, innocent and trusting, calling for their mother as Zephyrian warriors systematically murdered the children of New Eden for no reason other than psychological warfare. Deploy the payload, she ordered. Make sure the virus spreads through their entire population. The biological weapon that spread across Kethnara was Dr. Tanaka's most sophisticated creation, a virus that targeted Zephyrian reproductive cells while simultaneously enhancing their emotional capacity for loss and grief. The infected would live normal lifespans, but they would never have children, and they would spend their final years mourning the offspring they could never create. But perhaps more importantly, the virus carried genetic markers that identified it as artificially created by humans. Any Zephyrian who contracted it would know exactly who had condemned their species to extinction and why. The psychological impact spread faster than the biological weapon itself. Zephyrian colonies began evacuating at the first sign of human approach. Military units surrendered rather than risk infection. The Zephyrian Empire, which had dominated the galaxy through fear and superior technology, found itself paralyzed by an enemy that felt no fear and cared nothing for their own survival. In the Galactic Council chambers, emergency sessions convened daily as the implications of human warfare spread throughout civilized space. Species that had coexisted peacefully for millennia began to reconsider their own conflicts in light of humanity's response to the New Eden massacre. The Krillian ambassador approached the human delegation with a proposal that would have been unthinkable before the Children's War. Ambassador Chen, the Krillian Republic wishes to formally alliance with humanity. We offer our military resources in exchange for assurance that your biological weapons will never be used against our people. Chen studied the alien diplomat with the same cold calculation that characterized all human interactions since New Eden. Do the Krillians have a history of harming children? Never. Our species reveres the young above all else. Then you have nothing to fear from us. Chen's response was simple, but it carried implications that reverberated through the chamber. Humanity was not interested in conquest or territorial expansion. They had become something more focused and more dangerous, a species dedicated to ensuring that anyone who harmed children faced absolute consequences. The transformation was noticed by every species in the galaxy. The humans had changed from naive newcomers seeking their place among the stars to something that defied every category of galactic politics. They weren't conquerors, weren't traders, weren't even traditional warriors. They had become something unprecedented, a civilization that prioritized the protection of innocence over their own survival. On the Zephyrian homeworld, Emperor Kralthane faced reports that would have been impossible to believe a year ago. Entire Zephyrian fleets were surrendering without battle. Colonies were evacuating at rumors of human approach. The economic infrastructure that had supported their empire for 3 millennia was collapsing as fear spread faster than any military campaign. "Your Magnificence," War Leader Vox Tar reported, "our analysts have concluded that the humans are not seeking territorial conquest or resource acquisition. They appear to be focused solely on ensuring our extinction as punishment for the New Eden incident." The Emperor's 6 arms trembled with rage and something else, the first fear he had felt in his 3-century lifespan. What do they want? Terms? Reparations? Territorial concessions? Nothing, Your Magnificence. They want us dead. Every Zephyrian in the galaxy. The realization was staggering. The Zephyrian Empire had faced rebellions and wars throughout their history, but always with enemies who wanted something concrete. Freedom, resources, territory. But the humans wanted something that transcended traditional military objectives. They wanted justice for murdered children, and they had decided that justice required the complete extinction of the species responsible. Dr. Tanaka's latest biological weapon had been deployed on 17 Zephyrian worlds, ensuring that their species would be extinct within 2 generations. But more than that, the psychological components of the virus meant that every infected Zephyrian would spend their remaining years fully aware of why they were dying, haunted by memories of human children they had never personally harmed, but whose deaths their species had caused. The galaxy watched in fascination and horror as humanity systematically destroyed an empire that had dominated this sector of space for 3,000 years. But they did it not through military conquest or technological superiority, but through the simple application of biological science motivated by absolute determination to punish those who harmed innocents. Other species began to reevaluate their own relationships with humanity. Trade agreements were renegotiated to include specific protections for human children. Military alliances included clauses about the treatment of juveniles during conflicts. The Galactic community had learned a lesson that would influence interstellar politics for centuries. Humanity would tolerate almost anything except threats to their young. But perhaps the most significant development was taking place in human space itself. The war effort had consumed their entire civilization, transforming peaceful colonists into biological warfare specialists and converting cargo ships into weapons of mass destruction. Every human in the galaxy had committed their lives to a single purpose, ensuring that the children of New Eden were avenged and that no human child would ever suffer a similar fate. The cost was staggering. Human colonies had abandoned normal economic development to focus on war production. Scientific research was entirely directed toward developing more effective anti-Zephyrian weapons. Cultural development had been replaced by military training and weapons manufacturing, but when human parents looked at their own children sleeping safely in their beds, protected by a galaxy-spanning network of biological weapons and military assets dedicated to their security, the cost seemed worthwhile. The children of New Eden had died alone and afraid, but their deaths had created a universe where no human child would ever face such a fate again. The Zephyrians had wanted to send a message about power and fear. Instead, they had created a species so focused on protecting innocence that they were willing to commit genocide to ensure child safety. And, across the galaxy, every civilization was beginning to understand that humanity had evolved beyond traditional categories of political alliance and military threat. They had become something that the universe had never seen before, a species that would sacrifice everything, including their own humanity, to protect their children. And that made them more dangerous than any empire that had ever existed among the stars. The silence that filled the bridge of the UHS Retribution 2 was different from the focused quiet of battle stations. Admiral Rebecca Morrison studied the tactical displays showing the final Zephyrian stronghold, a planet called Zeph Prime, where the last survivors of their species had gathered in desperate hope of finding a cure for humanity's biological weapons. 18 months had passed since New Eden. The Zephyrian Empire, which had dominated this sector of the galaxy for 3 millennia, was now reduced to a single world harboring fewer than 50,000 survivors out of a population that had once numbered in the billions. Dr. Tanaka's biological weapons had been refined to a deadly art, ensuring not just death but awareness of why death was coming. "Admiral," her communications officer reported, "we're receiving a transmission from the planetary surface. It's from their Emperor." Morrison had imagined this moment countless times since watching the security footage from the New Eden Children's Center. The Zephyrian leader who had authorized the systematic murder of human children was finally ready to surrender. But as his image appeared on her screen, she felt something unexpected: the absence of satisfaction. Emperor Kralthane looked nothing like the confident predator who had built an empire on fear and calculated cruelty. The biological weapons had aged him decades in months. His scaled hide was mottled with the distinctive markings of genetic breakdown, and his 6 arms trembled with the neurological damage that preceded death. "Human Admiral," his voice carried the weight of a dying species, "I wish to negotiate terms for the survival of my people." Morrison thought about Sarah Chen's confused face as she died, about Marcus Williams trying to protect younger children with his small body, about little Emma Santos calling for her mother in Portuguese as her stuffed rabbit fell from dead fingers. What terms could you possibly offer that would outweigh the murder of 137 innocent children? The Emperor's mandibles clicked in what might have been a laugh or a sob. "There are no terms that could balance what we did. I know this, my people know this, but I must try, because the alternative is the extinction of everyone I have ever loved." It was Admiral Morrison's turn to laugh, but the sound held no humor. You should have thought about that before you decided that terrorizing human children was an acceptable military tactic. The transmission continued for several minutes, with the Emperor offering everything from complete technological transfer to permanent subservience to humanity, but Morrison had her orders. And more than that, she had her own memories of watching innocents die while their teacher tried desperately to protect them with her own body. "Admiral," her science officer interrupted. "Dr. Tanaka's requesting permission to deploy the final weapon." Morrison looked at the tactical display showing Zeph Prime, home to the last Zephyrians in the galaxy. 50,000 individuals, including their own children, who had played no role in the New Eden massacre. The irony was not lost on her. Humanity was about to commit genocide to avenge the murder of children by killing more children, but the children of Zeph Prime were Zephyrian children, members of the species that had chosen to make human innocence suffer for military advantage. And every human who had watched the New Eden footage had made the same cold calculation: better that no Zephyrian children exist than risk them growing up to hurt human children. "Deploy the weapon," Morrison ordered. The final biological weapon was Dr. Tanaka's masterpiece, a virus that attacked Zephyrian DNA at the cellular level, causing rapid decomposition while maintaining consciousness until the very end. It was designed to ensure that every Zephyrian died knowing exactly why they were dying and which species had condemned them to extinction. As the weapon spread through Zeph Prime's atmosphere, Morrison watched the planetary population centers go dark one by one. Within hours, the last Zephyrian empire was extinct, and humanity had achieved complete victory in the Children's War. But victory felt different than expected. The celebrations across human space were muted, confused by an emotion that no one wanted to acknowledge. They had avenged the children of New Eden, eliminated the threat that Zephyrians posed to human innocence, and established a precedent that would protect human children for generations. So why did it feel wrong? Dr. Yuki Tanaka stood in her laboratory aboard the research station Prometheus, looking at the biological samples that had made her the architect of species extinction. The woman who had created weapons capable of eliminating entire civilizations felt hollow inside, emptied of everything except the technical satisfaction of a job completed. "It's finished," she told Dr. Wright, who had worked beside her throughout the development of humanity's biological arsenal. "The Zephyrian species is extinct. No human child will ever face what happened on New Eden." Wright nodded, but his expression carried the same emptiness that had infected their entire team. "Then why don't I feel like we've won?" The answer came from an unexpected source: the final transmission from Zeph Prime, recorded moments before the last Zephyrian died. It wasn't from the Emperor or the military leadership, but from a Zephyrian equivalent of a teacher, surrounded by young Zephyrians who didn't understand why they were dying. "To the humans who watch this," the alien teacher said, her voice weak from the biological weapon coursing through her system, "we know why you have killed us. We understand that our species chose to murder your children, and that you have chosen to murder ours in response. Perhaps this is justice. But as I die surrounded by innocents who never harmed anyone, I wonder if your children would recognize the species you have become." The recording showed young Zephyrians dying in confusion and fear, calling for parents who were already dead, reaching for toys and comfort items as their bodies betrayed them. They looked remarkably similar to the children of New Eden, small, scared, and innocent of the crimes that had condemned them. Dr. Tanaka watched the recording in her laboratory and felt something crack inside her chest. She had spent 18 months creating biological weapons designed to cause maximum suffering to the species that had killed human children. But as she watched Zephyrian children die from her creations, she realized that she had become something she didn't recognize. The transformation wasn't limited to the scientists and military personnel who had prosecuted the war. Across human space, civilians who had cheered the destruction of Zephyrian military installations found themselves confronting the reality of what total victory meant. They had eliminated a species, not just defeated an enemy. On Earth, families who had demanded vengeance for New Eden gathered to watch the final transmissions from Zeph Prime and discovered that victory tasted of ashes. They had gotten exactly what they wanted: absolute justice for murdered children, ensured by the complete extinction of the species responsible. But the cost was becoming clear. Humanity had always prided itself on being the protectors of innocence, the species that valued children above everything else. But in pursuing perfect protection for human children, they had become willing to murder alien children. The moral mathematics of the situation defied easy resolution. Ambassador Chen Lu stood before the Galactic Council for the final time, representing a humanity that had achieved something unprecedented in galactic history: the complete destruction of a technologically superior enemy through biological warfare and absolute determination. "The Zephyrian Empire is extinct," she announced to the assembled alien delegates. "The threat to human children has been eliminated. Justice has been served for the innocents of New Eden." The silence in the ancient chambers stretched for long minutes. Finally, the Altarian representative spoke, their crystalline voice carrying millennia of diplomatic experience. "Ambassador Chen, your species has achieved a military victory that will be studied for generations. But we must ask, what have you become in the process?" Chen looked at the alien delegates who had once dismissed humanity as naive newcomers to galactic politics. Now they watched her species with a mixture of respect and fear that she found deeply uncomfortable. "We have become what was necessary to protect our children, and what was necessary was genocide." The word hung in the air like an accusation. Chen had anticipated the question, had prepared diplomatic responses about proportional justice and species survival. But standing in the ancient halls where civilizations came to resolve their differences peacefully, she found herself confronting the brutal reality of what humanity had chosen. "Yes," she said simply. "Genocide was necessary, because the alternative was accepting that someone could murder our children without facing absolute consequences." The implications rippled through the galactic community faster than any military fleet. Humanity had established a precedent that would influence interstellar relations for millennia, harm human children, and face species extinction. It was the ultimate deterrent, but it was also something that made other civilizations fundamentally uncomfortable with human presence in the galaxy. On the human colony of New Haven, former Captain Elena Rodriguez walked through a memorial garden dedicated to the children of New Eden. Her ship, the Vengeance, had been destroyed in the early battles of the war, but she had survived to see the complete victory she had helped achieve. The memorial was beautiful: 137 flowering trees, each one bearing the name of a child who had died in the New Eden Children's Center. Sarah Chen, Marcus Williams, Emma Santos, and all the others were remembered with crystalline plaques that caught the light of New Haven's sun and cast rainbow patterns across the garden paths. But as Rodriguez read the names and remembered the footage that had driven humanity to genocide, she found herself thinking about the Zephyrian children who had died on Zeph Prime. They didn't have memorial gardens. Their names would be forgotten along with their species, remembered only in the military reports that documented their extinction. "Captain?" A young voice interrupted her thoughts. Maria Santos, age 7, daughter of one of Rodriguez's former crew members, approached with the fearless curiosity of a child who had grown up in a galaxy made safe by overwhelming violence. "Hello, Maria. What brings you to the memorial?" The girl pointed to one of the trees, bearing the name Emma Santos. "My mama said that tree is for my sister who died before I was born. She said bad aliens hurt her, but that the grown-ups made sure they could never hurt anyone again." Rodriguez knelt to the girl's level, looking into eyes that held the innocence that had driven humanity to commit species extinction. "That's right. Your sister and all the other children are safe now. No one will ever hurt them again." "What about the bad alien children?" Maria asked, with the directness that only children possessed. "Did they get hurt too?" The question cut through Rodriguez like a laser. How could she explain to this innocent child that her safety had been purchased with the systematic murder of other innocents? How could she justify the moral calculus that had led humanity to become the very thing they had sought to protect their children from? "Yes," she said finally. "The bad alien children got hurt too." "Because the grown-ups decided that keeping you safe was more important than anything else in the galaxy. Maria nodded with the acceptance that children showed for adult explanations, but her next question revealed the uncomfortable truth that humanity was only beginning to confront. Does that make us bad aliens too? None of them did. Humanity had achieved perfect victory in the Children's War, eliminated every threat to their young, and established their species as the most feared in the galaxy. But they had done so by becoming willing to murder children to protect children, to commit genocide to prevent genocide. The final reports from across human space painted a picture of a civilization transformed by its own success. The biological weapons programs had been completed with scientific excellence. The military campaigns had achieved total victory through absolute determination. The diplomatic objectives had been accomplished through the simple expedient of making humanity too dangerous to oppose. But something fundamental had been lost in the process. The species that had begun the war to protect innocent children had ended it by murdering innocent children. The moral clarity that had driven them to seek justice for New Eden had been replaced by the cold recognition that justice and genocide could sometimes be the same thing. Dr. Tanaka's final report to the Human Colonial Authority was a masterpiece of scientific documentation, detailing the biological weapons that had made species extinction possible and the psychological warfare techniques that had broken Zephyrian resistance. But buried in the technical language was a confession that she could barely acknowledge to herself. She had become a monster in service of protecting children from monsters. Admiral Morrison returned to Earth as a hero, the military leader who had overseen humanity's greatest victory. Parades were held in her honor, and schools taught children about her tactical genius and unwavering dedication to protecting innocence. But when she looked in mirrors, she saw the face of someone who had ordered the extinction of an entire species and called it justice. The galaxy had learned to fear humanity, but humanity had learned to fear itself. They had achieved everything they wanted in the Children's War: absolute protection for their young, total victory over their enemies, and the establishment of humanity as a force that no species would dare challenge. But the cost was becoming clear in the quiet moments when parents looked at their sleeping children and wondered what kind of universe they had created for them. The children of New Eden had been avenged. The Zephyrian Empire was extinct. Human children were safer than they had ever been in galactic history. But as humanity stood victorious in a galaxy that now trembled at their approach, they began to realize that perfect protection might come at the cost of everything they had once believed about themselves. They had won the war, but the victory felt like defeat. They had protected their innocence by murdering innocents. They had preserved their humanity by abandoning their humanity. And in the end, the greatest casualty of the Children's War might not have been the Zephyrian Empire, but the soul of the species that had committed genocide in the name of love. 5 years had passed since the last Zephyrian died on their homeworld, and humanity ruled the galaxy through fear more complete than anything the old empire had ever achieved. No species dared to threaten human children, no military force challenged human expansion, and no diplomatic entity questioned human demands. They had created the perfect deterrent through perfect brutality. But perfection, as Dr. Yuki Tanaka had learned, came with a price that no one had calculated. She stood in her new laboratory on Earth, surrounded by biological samples from 17 different species that had shown even minor aggression toward human colonies. Each sample represented a potential extinction weapon, catalogued and stored for deployment at the first sign of threat to human interests. The woman who had once studied alien biology to understand the universe's diversity now maintained an arsenal capable of sterilizing entire worlds. Dr. Pequod Bentu Tanaka, her assistant, announced, "The Altarian delegation has arrived for the consultation." The Altarians had ruled their sector of the galaxy for 8,000 years through wisdom and diplomacy. Their crystalline physiology made them ideal mediators, capable of processing multiple perspectives simultaneously and finding common ground between conflicting species. But now they came to Earth not as mediators, but as supplicants seeking humanity's permission for actions that would have been unthinkable before the Children's War. Ambassador Kethlear entered the laboratory with the careful movements of someone approaching a dangerous predator. The crystalline being's usual confident demeanor had been replaced by the measured caution that characterized all alien interactions with humanity since Zeph Prime. Dr. Cass. "Tanaka, we are grateful for your willingness to meet with us. The Altarian Republic seeks approval for establishing a mining operation in the Kepler sector." Tanaka looked up from her biological samples with the casual attention of someone reviewing routine paperwork. The Kepler sector was 300 light-years from the nearest human colony, posed no conceivable threat to human interests, and contained resources that the Altarians had been mining for millennia. But in the new galaxy, human permission was required for any action that might, in the most theoretical sense, eventually impact human security. "Have you submitted the standard biological compliance documentation?" she asked. Ambassador Kethlear produced a data crystal containing detailed analysis of every species in the Kepler sector, complete biological profiles of the Altarian work crews, and sworn statements that no action would be taken that could potentially harm human children anywhere in the galaxy. The documentation was thousands of pages long and represented months of preparation by teams of alien biologists and legal experts. Tanaka reviewed the submission with the efficiency of someone who processed dozens of similar requests weekly. Since the extinction of the Zephyrian Empire, humanity had established itself as the galaxy's biological warfare authority. Any species that wanted to take action anywhere in known space required human approval to ensure they posed no theoretical threat to human children. "Approved," she said finally, stamping the documentation with symbols that had become the most feared marking in galactic politics. "Standard biological monitoring protocols apply. Any deviation from submitted parameters will result in immediate sterilization of your species." The Altarian ambassador accepted the approval with visible relief, but as they prepared to leave, they asked the question that had been troubling the galactic community since humanity's total victory. "Dr. Tanaka, may I ask how many species you have eliminated since the Zephyrian War ended?" Tanaka consulted her records with the clinical detachment that had replaced her earlier scientific enthusiasm. 17 species have been sterilized for violations of child protection protocols. 4 species have been rendered extinct for attempted aggression against human interests. 31 species have been subjected to modified biological weapons for non-compliance with galactic safety standards. The numbers represented billions of individuals across dozens of worlds, entire civilizations erased because they had failed to meet humanity's standards for child safety. But what made the statistics truly chilling was Tanaka's tone. She reported the extinction of species with the same emotional investment that she might use to discuss laboratory maintenance schedules. "Do you ever wonder," the Altarian asked carefully, "if the children you sought to protect would approve of what you've become?" It was the question that haunted humanity's leaders, though none of them would admit it publicly. Tanaka looked at the biological samples surrounding her, each one representing the power to commit genocide, and felt the familiar emptiness that had replaced her earlier scientific curiosity. "The children we sought to protect are dead," she replied. "The children we have protected don't need to know the methods required to ensure their safety." On the colony world of New Heaven, 7-year-old Michael Chen played in gardens that had been built on the ruins of a Krillian settlement. The Krillians had been eliminated 3 years ago for establishing a military training facility that human analysts determined could potentially be used to threaten human children in some future scenario. Their extinction had taken less than a week once Dr. Tanaka's weapons were deployed. Michael knew none of this. To him, New Heaven was simply home. A beautiful world where children played safely under the protection of adults who ensured that nothing bad could ever happen to them. He attended school with 43 other human children, learned about Earth's history and humanity's expansion among the stars, and dreamed of becoming an explorer who would discover new worlds for human settlement. His teacher, Ms. Monica Rodriguez, was the former captain, Elena Rodriguez, who had sacrificed her ship in the early days of the Children's War. She had retired from military service to education, hoping to find meaning in shaping the next generation of humans who would inherit the galaxy their parents had conquered. "Today we're going to learn about contact protocols," she announced to her class of second graders. "When humans meet new alien species, what's the most important thing we do?" Michael's hand shot up enthusiastically. "We make sure they can't hurt human children." "That's right, Michael. And how do we make sure of that?" "We test their biology and make weapons that can eliminate them if they're bad," answered Sarah Kim, daughter of a former Colonial Authority director. Rodriguez felt the familiar chill that came from hearing children recite lessons about genocide with the same enthusiasm they showed for mathematics or reading. These children had grown up in a galaxy where species extinction was routine policy, where biological warfare was considered normal diplomacy, and where their safety was ensured through the systematic elimination of anyone who might theoretically pose a threat. "And what happened to the species that hurt children before we learned to protect ourselves?" Rodriguez asked, though she dreaded the response. "They all died," the children responded in unison, their voices bright with the satisfaction of a lesson well learned. Rodriguez looked at their eager faces and saw the future of humanity, a generation that would consider genocide a reasonable response to theoretical threats, species extinction a normal diplomatic tool, and biological warfare an acceptable method of ensuring security. They were perfectly safe, completely protected, and utterly lacking in the moral framework that had once defined human civilization. These children would never face the terror that had consumed the innocence of New Eden, but they would also never know the compassion that had once motivated humanity to protect all children, not just human ones. They were growing up in a universe where safety came through the systematic elimination of difference, where security required the extinction of anyone who failed to meet human standards for acceptable behavior. After school, Rodriguez walked through the memorial garden dedicated to the children of New Eden, reading the names that had become the justification for humanity's transformation into the galaxy's most feared species. Sarah Chen, Marcus Williams, Emma Santos, and all the others were remembered as martyrs whose deaths had awakened humanity to the necessity of absolute protection through absolute violence. But what would those children think of the universe that had been created in their memory? Would Sarah Chen approve of the 17 species that had been sterilized in her name? Would Marcus Williams support the biological weapons programs that ensured no human child would face his fate by making sure that alien children faced worse? Would little Emma Santos, who had loved her stuffed rabbit and drawn pictures of her family and her alien sons, understand why her death had become justification for genocide? The questions tormented Rodriguez, but they were questions that humanity no longer allowed itself to ask publicly. The moral calculations that had once seemed so clear in the aftermath of New Eden had become a labyrinth of justifications that led inevitably to the conclusion that any action was acceptable if it protected human children. On Earth, the Human Colonial Authority convened its annual assessment of galactic security threats. The council chamber was filled with officials who had overseen humanity's rise to galactic dominance, but their faces carried the weight of decisions that had transformed their species into something unrecognizable. Director Sarah Kim presented the year's statistics with the efficiency that had made her one of humanity's most effective administrators. 12 species eliminated for potential threats to human interests. 37 species subjected to biological modification to ensure compliance with human security requirements. 41 species relocated from their homeworlds to prevent possible future conflicts with human expansion. The numbers represented a galaxy systematically cleansed of anything that might theoretically threaten human children. But they also represented the transformation of humanity from protectors of innocence into the galaxy's greatest threat to innocence. "Any questions?" Kim asked, though she knew there would be none. Questioning the methods used to protect human children had become the closest thing to treason in the new human civilization. Ambassador Chen Liu, now serving as Director of Galactic Relations, provided the diplomatic summary: all major species have submitted to human oversight of their biological development, military capabilities, and population management. No species currently poses a theoretical threat to human children anywhere in the galaxy. It was perfect victory achieved through perfect control. But the cost was becoming visible even to those who refused to acknowledge it openly. Humanity had eliminated every external threat to their children by becoming the primary threat to everyone else's children. In her private moments, Kim allowed herself to remember the person she had been before New Eden, someone who believed in diplomatic solutions, species cooperation, and the possibility of a galaxy where different civilizations could coexist peacefully. But that person had died along with the children in the New Eden Children's Center, replaced by an administrator who managed genocide with the same attention to detail she had once applied to trade negotiations. Dr. Tanaka's research had evolved beyond weapons designed for specific species. Her latest project involved biological agents that could be rapidly modified to target any alien physiology, allowing humanity to eliminate new species within hours of first contact rather than weeks of analysis. It was the ultimate insurance policy. Any species they encountered could be instantly sterilized if they showed even theoretical signs of potential aggression toward human interests.
"We've achieved perfect security," she told her research team during their final project meeting.
"No human child will ever face the fate of the New Eden innocents. We have eliminated that possibility by eliminating everything that could cause it." Her assistant, Dr. Feedback End, Wright looked at the biological warfare arsenal they had created and asked the question that had haunted him for 5 years. But what have we become in the process? Tanaka looked at him with eyes that had watched species die and felt nothing beyond scientific satisfaction. We've become what was necessary. We've become protectors of human children, regardless of the cost to ourselves or anyone else. And is that enough? It was the question that defined post-war humanity. Was protecting their children worth becoming something that no longer deserved to have children? Was safety worth sacrificing every other value they had once held? Was perfect security worth perfect isolation in a galaxy that feared them more than anything that had ever existed among the stars? The children of the new generation would never know the universe that had existed before New Eden, never experience the wonder of discovering alien civilizations that might be different but not dangerous. They would grow up in a galaxy cleansed of threat through the systematic elimination of difference, protected by parents who had chosen to become monsters rather than risk their children facing monsters, and perhaps that was enough. Perhaps the transformation of humanity into the galaxy's apex predator was a price worth paying for ensuring that no human child would ever again die as Sarah Chen had died, confused and afraid as aliens systematically murdered her for psychological warfare. But as the years passed and the body count of extinct species grew, humanity faced a question that had no easy answer. Had they saved their children by destroying the universe those children would inherit? Had they protected human innocence by eliminating their own? The galaxy trembled before human power, but humanity itself trembled before the recognition of what they had become. They had achieved everything they wanted in response to New Eden: absolute protection for their children, complete victory over their enemies, and perfect security in a universe that no longer dared to threaten them. But in the quiet moments when they looked at their sleeping children, human parents wondered if they had saved their young by becoming something that no longer deserved to be called human. They had won the war, controlled the galaxy, and eliminated every threat to human children. All that remained was the question of whether humanity itself had survived the victory. In the Memorial Garden of New Heaven, 7-year-old Michael Chen played beneath trees planted in memory of children who had died to awaken his species to the necessity of absolute protection. He was perfectly safe, completely secure, and utterly unaware that his safety had been purchased with the extinction of 68 species and the biological subjugation of hundreds more. He was the future of humanity, a child who would grow up never knowing that aliens could be anything other than threats to be eliminated, never experiencing the wonder of diversity that had once made the galaxy beautiful, never understanding that protection and genocide were not synonymous. The children of New Eden had been avenged beyond anything they could have imagined. But in the process, humanity had become something that those innocent children might not recognize as the species that had produced them. Perfect victory had come at the cost of perfect humanity. And in the end, the greatest tragedy of the children's war might not have been the massacre that started it, but the civilization that had ended it, a species so dedicated to protecting innocence that they had lost their own.